Let me just take a quick minute and thank Dr. Malone on behalf of the Daniels College of Business for being here. This is a special day for us to have a captain of industry here, and many of you may not know he's a legend in the cable industry in terms of his strategy and financial pursuits that he'll share with us today. But we're fortunate, sort of our partner in all of this is the Cable Center, and the Cable Center has a special program to bring cable industry executives into the classroom. So this is really part of that program, the Cable Mavericks program. So let me introduce Jenna Henthorn. Jenna is the Senior Vice President of Academic and Industry Outreach at the Cable Center. She's a longtime cable pioneer, over 25 years experience in the industry. She's going to officially welcome Dr. Malone.
Thank you, Ron. The Cable Center is really so pleased, along with DU, to have this very special lecture, because Dr. Malone, as Dr. Rizzuto said, is really one of the true cable mavericks and pioneers, and certainly a very influential leader. Events like this are part of our lecture series, which also includes our one-day master's forum, which we've given you a save the date on. It's coming up in October in New York City, but if you aren't in New York City on October 26th, don't worry, because we're streaming it live. And it's a one-day event where you'll learn all you need to know to get a job and start a career in the wonderful high-tech industry of cable. So, along with that save the date flyer, we've also given you Dr. Malone's bio, and I know you've all researched him and Liberty Global, and you'll have lots of good questions. But let me just add a couple of details. In addition to the many boards that Dr. Malone serves on, we're proud to say that he is a member of the Cable Center's honorary board, and he was instrumental in creating the Center's Magnus Institute, which continues to support our mission of bringing together the university community with the cable industry. He's a renowned thought leader on the global media business, and his company's investments, and when I say companies, that's S apostrophe, his company's investments in networks and services really it's many of the things that you watch in the cable industry today, and the networks that you watch and the products that you use. He's passionate about technology, both from an innovation standpoint and also from a real-time, real-life deployment. He's known for seeing strategic moves far in the future, but he also has great stories on the beginnings of the cable industry. And as I told him when we were taking some pictures earlier, it's a great honor for me to have my picture taken with Dr. Malone. I'd really rather have my picture taken with him than with Paul McCartney or Bruce Springsteen, because he really is the rock star of the cable industry. So please join me in welcoming Dr. John Malone.
Here, just the format, it's a Q&A format. Rand and I and Randy, we sort of collaborated on the first question, and then we'll ask it, but we encourage everyone to ask away. These are all the tough questions that we deferred till today. So we lined them up here for you. We give them homework to read so they know the company in and out. Don't quiz them necessarily on the Morgan Stanley report. But the key thing, this course is focused on strategic finance, and we had the opportunity to chat with Dr. Malone a few minutes before we got here, and he was just talking about his experience with deals, and he was saying he's on average done one deal a week for the last 44 years. So these are a lot of mergers and acquisitions deals, a lot of financing transactions, a lot of corporate restructuring. So maybe the first question we'd ask is sort of, as you look at the deals I know you have a almost perfect batting record here, but what are the key ingredients that makes a deal work? What are the key factors that you look at? What are the things that you know instinctive from the very beginning that this is going to work or it's not?
Wow, that's a broad one. No, deals. You know, the easiest deals are the ones where you're buying another business or merging it in the business you're already in. Those are easy. They're easy to figure out. They're generally horizontal acquisitions. And you gain scale, synergies. The bulk of the ones that we've done over the years were what you'd call rolling up the cable industry. When the cable industry started, pretty much every community issued a franchise to operate in that community. Typically, they would issue the franchise to local people, usually politicians or their friends. And so the industry started 50 years ago, very, very balkanized, thousands of individual cable franchises. And over time, those congealed into the cable industry. Process even continues to this day with a few larger transactions. As the cosmology, the concentration of these assets grew in the U.S., that same process is going on around the world right now. So that is a horizontal integration process. It drives scale, size, balance sheet size, financial capability. Then you have the vertical type deals. So I own a cable system. So what am I going to carry on my cable system? You know, if all I'm going to carry is the broadcasting programming, what am I really adding? So then the issue became, and this is an issue in the early 80s, how do you create channels? How do you create programming that people are interested in enough that they will subscribe to your cable service, pay for the programming? And that was the vertical phase. And so I'd say through the 80s, we probably invested in or acquired probably 30 different companies that were in the programming development and distribution business. Things like CNN or Discovery or Black Entertainment Television or Telemundo or, you know, on and on and on. Stars. So there was that process of developing the programming and having the distribution. Then we got into the technology areas. As we had scale and we had a large budget to purchase and deploy capital, we got into, you know, digital programming, digital set tops. We were the first guys who created digital television, compressed digital television in the home. We created a thing called At Home, which was the first high-speed broadband connectivity in North America using cable technology. Now, of course, that's gone on to where the industry generally is deploying speeds up to 120 megabits, capability of going faster. So, you know, it's been an evolutionary process of identifying the need and then trying to build the technologies around it. And the relationships you have with other providers, whether they're programmers, put you in partnership with all kinds of people. I mentioned Ted Turner, but News Corp, Rupert Murdoch, to create the Fox News Network. Just in the technology area, we had longstanding partnerships with Microsoft when Bill Gates first started. He was a co-provider of the digital set-top when it started. So just the whole process of building an industry, putting together the pieces. A lot of it was done through acquisition, merger, joint ventures, pretty much all the stuff you guys study in strategic finance, I guess you call it.
In there, we've seen a lot of what people call roadkill in the merger and acquisition arena. But what would you say would be the ingredients when companies, they make an acquisition and then it doesn't turn out? Why is that?
Well, there's lots of reasons. A lot of it is cultural. You're trying to blend. I mean, our experience was, we were headquartered out here in the Denver area. Our guys were all kind of cowboys. And we learned pretty quickly in our acquisitions, pretty much to kill the leadership and anything we bought. You could call it the Roman Empire approach, but you would basically, let's call it retire to be kind. You would retire the guys who you made rich when you bought their company, because culturally, they didn't want to work hard anymore. Probably the reason they sold the company to you was their wife was nagging them to take it easy. They were working too hard. So the first thing you learn is, once you make a guy rich, don't expect him to work hard. Very unusual people do that. And even if they say they're going to, they've run their own company, they're not going to work very hard working within your company. So that was one lesson. You pick the brightest guys you find in the company you've acquired who weren't running it, and you make them the new management, and you build horizontally that way. And you avoid this cultural clash that I think really hurts a lot of companies. If you try and blend cultures that are too different, it's very hard and disruptive, takes years, usually doesn't work. So that's lesson number one in the merger and acquisition area. The other is, plain and simple, vertical acquisitions are much tougher than horizontal ones, because you're essentially buying a business you don't know and you don't understand. Whereas buying, one like yours, you're already in it. You understand it, you know the people, you know the economics, much simpler. So a lot of vertical acquisitions don't work. I mean, if you're looking for an example, say the acquisition or the merger of AOL with Time Warner, which was probably the biggest disaster in merger history. The cultures were completely different. The Time Warner people were traditional media people. The AOL people were go-go internet people. AOL was frankly just the big puff bag, didn't have any real assets. It had grown so fast that its accounting was, let's say, inaccurate to be kind. And the people at Time Warner did no diligence. They put the two companies together, and basically the value collapsed shortly thereafter. So that's a huge one that didn't work. We're lucky, none of our, in growing the company, we didn't have any really bad experiences with value destruction. Probably the biggest destructive merger that I've been involved in was when we sold our big cable company, TCI, to AT&T. And that was, at the time it happened and agreed to in 1999, it was the largest merger in the U.S. business history up to that point in time. It was about $60 billion. And unfortunately, the AT&T people got into the cable business for the wrong reason. They didn't really understand it. They thought it was going to be a solution to their problem of connecting the last mile in their telephony network. They were a little bit naive about that, and To give you rough numbers, in 1999, AT&T had a cash flow, EBITDA, of $16 billion, and they owed no net debt. Okay, by 2001, AT&T owed $78 billion and had an EBITDA of $9 billion. Okay, a destruction of value that is kind of monumental. You can't sleep and make that happen. You have to do a bunch of bad deals in order to bury your company that fast, that deep, and destroy, the momentum of a business. So that was a disaster. It was a disaster for the shareholders. It was a disaster for me personally because I was the largest shareholder. And I watched $3.5 billion of personal net worth decline rather rapidly, go down to about $500 million. And I could not sell it because I was an insider. I was blocked from selling it. So that was a disaster. Okay, and on paper it looked terrific. My shareholders were getting AT&T stock, a company that had been around for 100 years, very liquid stock, AAA credit rating, and they were getting it at a big premium. They were paying a 40% premium in stock for our company. And so everybody thought this is wonderful, a big price, a big premium, and a liquid stock. And it was for those who were smart enough to sell. Unfortunately, some of us couldn't or wouldn't or didn't. And, the residue of that company got acquired by Comcast for pennies on the dollar a few years later. So the Comcast that you see around today, those trucks running around, are most of the assets were the old AT&T TCI assets. So that's one run that didn't work, and I think there's certainly plenty of examples of disastrous combinations, but usually it has to do with the mergers being made for the wrong reason, or there's a complete lacking of understanding of what the other business, the acquired business, is really all about.
They're made for the wrong reasons. Did you mention AT&T? They were looking to solve their problem with the merger. But at what point? I mean, they hired the best talent, legal talent, accounting talent, financial talent.
Unfortunately, they didn't. Unfortunately, they didn't. They thought they knew what they were doing. They thought they understood the cable business. The chairman CEO of AT&T at the time was a fellow by the name of Mike Armstrong, who had been the chairman of DirecTV, which was a General Motors-owned company that was in the satellite business. And he assumed, since he knew the satellite video business, that would translate easily into an understanding of the cable business. And it really didn't. It really didn't. And so they went on an acquisition foray in which they first bought TCI, then they bought Media One. They did a whole series of joint ventures which were pretty much financially disastrous. And then, since this is strategic finance, when they bought Media One, they financed it with commercial paper. They issued $28 billion worth of commercial paper, which was due in 90 days. And when the 90 days was up, they had basically no easy way to roll it over or refinance it. Now, the timing caught them because this was right when the bubble was bursting in 2000. And so they found themselves with a short-term financing and financial markets that were running away from them. And they really had to scramble. They ended up selling pretty much to the Japanese their cellular phone business, which was probably their most valuable future business. They sold that to NTT, or sold a large stake in it to NTT. So they had to take a whole series of short-term liquidations in order to take care of that financing mistake that they had made. So, it was a series of errors. In fact, there's a book called The End of the Line that chronicles the decline and fall of AT&T as the nation's phone company. Now, you guys may say, well, there's an AT&T. I can go buy a cell phone. That's a different AT&T. That's the old subsidiary from Pactel and from Bell South that basically ended up buying what was left of the long-distance business of AT&T and changed their name to AT&T. It's a different company. It's a company that my career has been wound in and around for years. I started right out of graduate school, actually right out of college at Bell Labs, AT&T Bell Labs. And then when I went to McKinsey, I ended up doing a reorganization study of one of the Bell subsidiaries, New Jersey Bell, as an example. In 1993, we announced the merger of, or we would call it the acquisition of, what is now Verizon by TCI, and it got blown up by the government. So, and then in 1999, we merged TCI into AT&T, which was the umbrella parent company that still had the long-distance business. So, long history. Sat on their board for 2 years and a week. It was a week too long. And now, as part of strategic finance, should explain that this is where tracking stocks came in, because AT&T wanted to buy our domestic cable company, just US. They did not want to buy all the other assets, the programming assets, the international assets, and so on, that we had accumulated over time. So when we merged TCI into AT&T, we created a tracking stock to represent the assets that AT&T did not want to acquire, okay? But in order to make it all tax efficient, we had to put them all together. Then we had to wait 2 years, and then we could legally separate them with no taxes. And that's basically how Liberty came into existence again in 2001, 2 years after the original merger. So that was a structural, financial, tax efficient strategy that allowed us to combine assets and then separate assets and not go through a lot of tax leakage.
Go ahead.
I was just curious, it seems like there's so many potential pitfalls with vertical integration. What's your process for identifying acquisition opportunities, and I guess at which point in that process does the finance come into it? At what point do you start looking at balance sheets and income statements? How far down the line is that?
Well, I think the best example of vertical integration is, for instance, I get a phone call from Rupert Murdoch. He says, CNN exists. I've got a company called News Corporation. I would love to have a cable television news channel in the United States. What do you think, right? And I say to him, well, there's probably room for another one, but you got to come down in terms of your political posture a little bit to the right of center, right? Because CNN is going a little bit to the left of center, in the opinion of certainly people on the right of center. So he says, I think that's great. Will you help me? Right? I.e., will you invest with me? And so we say, yeah, well, what do you want us to do? He said, well, why don't you, A, agree to distribute our channel? B, I want you to go see if you can recruit Rush Limbaugh to be on my channel, because I knew him. C, how about 20% of this thing, if it works, right? So we launch Fox News Channel. We own 20% of it. We distribute it. He programs it. We take relatively little risk because we don't put any money up. Okay? What we agreed to do was carry the channel, right, pay a fee per customer, an affiliate fee, and depend on him to do a good job of promoting it and creating it. We end up owning 20% of what turns out to be a valuable asset. That's the most no-brainer of the things you can do. The other end of the spectrum, you get a phone call from Ted Turner, an old friend. He said, you got to do something. You got to do something. What have I got to do, Ted? Well, you got to raise me a bunch of money or it's going to be the KNN. I said, well, what's the KNN? He says, the Kerkorian News Network, right? Because he had bought MGM from Kirk Kerkorian. He had way over leveraged to buy it. And now he was running out of money. And his deal with Kerkorian was if he couldn't pay him interest in cash, he had to pay him interest in stock. And his stock was spiraling down, and he was issuing it. The more he issued, the lower the stock price, the more he had to issue. So it was pretty clear in about 4 or 5 quarters, Kirk would own Turner Broadcasting, CNN. So we had to go out and raise Ted a bunch of money, okay, by making an investment. And this was one we took to the cable industry as opposed to doing it ourselves only. And we had to raise what was quite a bit of money then, and this would have been 1986 or 87. In order to buy his freedom from Kerkorian, we had to raise about $700 million, which was a lot of equity in those days. We put together a consortium. Now the risk in that deal, we were all going to own equity in what was then a public company. My company was going to be the largest shareholder. We were putting up, I think, half the money, 350. And so the risk was, is Ted a nut? What other trouble is he going to get us into? Can we negotiate an agreement with Ted that will limit his flexibility, let's call it that, to get us into trouble? Is he going to start another Goodwill Games and compete with the Olympics? What's Ted going to do? And so that was the risk, I think, in that deal. It was really investing with a very headstrong entrepreneur that who had been able to get himself into trouble by acquisition, rash type behavior. In the end, it turned out Ted is a much better businessman than we had thought, but also we had a covenant in our relationship that he couldn't spend more than $2 million without my approval, so it kind of helped. And we felt comfortable, and it worked. I mean, we all made a lot of money on that investment. Ultimately, his company was merged into Time Warner, and we all became very large shareholders of Time Warner, which was great until they merged with AOL and lost it all. So, these are things that, you sit there and you say, well, then why did we let that happen? If we were such a large shareholder, and Ted was such a large shareholder in Time Warner, why did he allow the AOL merger to take place? Good question. And the reason is the government took our votes away. So we couldn't vote. We were the largest shareholder, but because we had antitrust issues, competition issues between TCI, Liberty, and Time Warner, the government said you can own the shares, but you got to put them in trust. You can't vote them. Okay, so we didn't have any votes, and Ted got swept away with the concept of having this huge combination of AOL and Time Warner. So the first time he heard about it, he signed an agreement that he would support it. So there went his votes, and that was it. So no diligence. I mean, the most important thing in these deals is plenty of time for diligence, plenty of people involved in the process, and so that emotion and enthusiasm don't take the place of thinking it through, building the models, getting down to the nitty-gritties of exactly why is this going to work? What are we doing this for? What's going to get suddenly better in these two companies if we put them together, and what's not going to work? I mean, that was a classic example of one that really didn't work because there was no diligence done. The guy who was at the time the chairman CEO of Time Warner got carried away with pomposity, pardon the expression, that he was going to have the biggest thing that anybody had ever had, you know, $300 billion market cap company at that time. And he couldn't see past that. And that's what happened. So these, you know, size is no guarantee against colossal mistakes. In fact, it almost guarantees it. Yeah.
Kind of in that same vein, you know, with hindsight being 2020, what do you think you would have found during the due diligence process that would have keyed you to feel like it was maybe a mistake to merge those two companies, or did you have a feeling, regardless of the fact you couldn't vote, that they might be heading down the wrong way?
No, I had strong feelings that you were trying to combine something that was real with something that was ephemeral, right? I mean, maybe Facebook works, maybe it doesn't. But a company that's trading at you know, virtually an infinite multiple of earnings, okay, is all on the come, is not one that I would want to merge my $100 billion, you know, meat and potatoes company with. And I think that was it. It's not, I know Steve Case very, very well, who was the founder of AOL. In fact, we had a chance to buy 25% of AOL several years earlier for about $130 million. So, you know, we knew the history, we knew the players. When you got into AOL, if you'd done diligence, you would have found that a lot of the revenue that was reported as if it was recurring, you know, the concept, was in fact one time. What they were doing, for those of you, you're too young to remember that the beginnings of the bubble, most of you are, Ron isn't. But what they were doing is, if you wanted to think about the front screen, think it as if it was the front screen on an iPad, okay? And there was only one front screen for the whole country in this burgeoning internet world, right? And if you wanted to put your name or your advertisement or a link to your website on that one screen, you had to buy it from AOL, right? And so what they were doing is they were going in and saying, well, give us 10% of your company and we'll link to you, right? Now, these were startup companies. Many of them themselves weren't really businesses. They were ideas. They were out raising money from the venture capital world. So they were taking what money they could raise from the venture capital world and turning around and paying it to AOL to get on the screen, right? And in some cases, they were giving AOL stock in their company as opposed to cash, right? So AOL was treating this as if it was recurring revenue, right? The reality was this was one-time stuff. And so they were way overstating their revenues. In fact, a lot of them got in serious trouble with the SEC after the bubble blew up over the way they were accounting. But fundamentally, what you were trying to marry is a company that was trading at, let's say, 9 times cash flow with a company that was trading at an infinite times cash flow. And people were treating traffic to the website as if it was money. And it wasn't. That correlation, that valuation that people were coming up with. And this was a very common mistake that was made in those times. People were, in the internet world, they were thinking that traffic sooner or later would get monetized. Okay? And therefore, they were putting economic values and competing for traffic and buying traffic, paying big prices for traffic. There was a company called Blue Mountain, okay, traded for like $1.5 billion, 0 revenue. It was in the online greeting card business. And you could go to Blue Mountain and you could download a greeting card and you could send it off to your friends. It was free, had lots of traffic, okay? Never made the transition to economic viability. So the internet world was full of those bubble phenomena, vaporware companies, we call them. They came and they went. Now, here was the dilemma that we had, because we had a bunch of them. I mean, we had started a whole bunch of little startup companies, and during the bubble period, they were getting market valuations that were completely absurd. You know, you would find a company with 3 employees that just had an idea, was just created, and it would be trading at $1.5 billion of equity value. And everybody would say, well, why don't you use the equity, right? Well, you can imagine going out and selling this vaporware to some widow, and you end up in jail, right? I mean, there's no way you can make representations that this is real. So the problem is, a lot of times when the market gets crazy like that, gets overheated, there's really nothing you can do is sit there and watch it. If you get out there and say, my company isn't worth that, your shareholders will kill you. If you get out there and try and issue that stock to somebody, whoever buys it is going to end up killing you. So, that's a tough world. And we get into those crazy situations every once in a while. And, if you're a professional trader, you can probably make money shorting the stock if you can borrow it. The other phenomenon of these kind of companies is usually there's no stock to borrow. And the reason why the price is so high is because they're so thinly traded, that there's no borrow in the stock, and so the normal market forces that would tend to bring reality just don't exist. Now, I'll give you an example. I had an intern that worked for me, probably 6 or 7 years ago, that was one of the co-founders of Facebook. And he came to see me about 2 years ago, and he wanted to know what he should do because he owned a bunch of stock. Right? He was still an employee. But here was the dilemma. Zuckerberg told him, if you sell the stock, you can't be an employee. Right? So he was trying to figure out, should he sell the stock into the secondary market that was the non-public market. And I'm not sure what he did. But, we'll see. I'm sure in the next week or two we'll find out whether he made a mistake or not. Yeah.
Can you speak a little bit about synergies? Many times when there's a merger, they announce how much synergies they expect to be realized. Are those synergies realized? Is that a good reason to merge in the first place, or is it come with a cost?
No, it's a very good reason if they're real. Okay. I mean, let me give you an example. We have a cable system. Our international company has a cable system in Puerto Rico. Okay. Puerto Rico is the only place in which we operate that uses signals programming from the United States. Okay? Everything else we have is in Europe or Australia or somewhere else, right? Latin America. But this one is a small operating business, okay, that buys its programming from the U.S. program suppliers. And it's small, has no purchasing power at all. If it was to be acquired by a U.S. cable operator of size, it would save probably $40 or $50 million a year on its programming cost, okay? Because you would be buying programming under the new owner's contracts instead of the old. Very pure synergy, very easy to calculate, and anybody figuring out what that acquisition's worth would build that right into those numbers. Then you get into overheads. Can we shave? Can we operate more efficiently than the guy we're buying it from? Those are, you got to really know the business. If you have the cable system next door and you buy the one next to you, those synergies are pretty real. I mean, you don't need the management over there. They don't need an office. They don't need, right? You can calculate those. Those are very real. Those are horizontal synergies. Usually they're quite calculable. When you get more into things like it'll help the brand or, you know, those are intangibles, and those are much harder. The other synergies that I think are very real and calculable are the financial synergies. Taxes. When we buy that guy, a good example, I'll give you an example of a big tax-driven synergy. The New York metropolitan area principal cable suppliers is Cablevision Systems. Very profitable company, operates just in that area, pays a full tax load. Roughly 40% of their pre-tax income goes in taxes. They get a chance to buy the assets of a small cable operator. This one happens to be called Bresnan Communications. It was scattered around the West. Okay? They can go out and buy those assets, step them up for tax purposes. They can borrow 100% of the money against the assets they're acquiring. And between the program cost savings, because they buy programming cheaper, and the tax savings, because now they would be consolidating for tax purposes this newly acquired asset, they can pay for the whole acquisition just out of those two synergies, okay? Not using any of their own equity, not even guaranteeing the loan that's made to make the acquisition. That's real financial synergy. And so those are very real. And, you know, the operating synergies, you got to be skeptical about them unless you can go down the line items and see exactly, you know, that one over there has 11 office people and this one has 8, and I put them together, am I really going to reduce it below 19, you know? I mean, it gets down to that. And the financial synergies, you know, the accountants basically look at that and do the pro forma and see, you know, what are the tax savings? Are we going to be able to finance this cheaper? That kind of synergy. Those are the two real synergies, I think, that you build into an acquisition plan. And, you know, they're real. The vertical synergies usually turn out to be harder to find and to justify.
Just to tag on, just a short question is, this group just finished this Procter & Gamble and Gillette merger, and synergies were rampant both on the operating side and the revenue side, or at least the projection. Speak to the revenue synergies. What's your experience with revenue synergies?
Well, I mean, the simplest revenue synergies is if when I had TCI in the U.S. and I went out and I bought a small cable network, okay, I could put that cable network on my distribution, and immediately they would have an extra 15 million customers, they would get immediately that much more advertising revenue and their broader reach. I mean, those kind of revenue synergies are, where you know exactly what you're going to do when you buy it. Okay? Rupert Murdoch knew that if he got TCI to launch Fox News, and TCI was going to pay him, I don't know, 20 or 25 cents a month a customer, times 15 million customers, times 12 months, that was real money, A. B, that extra 15 million households that his programming was going to be displayed in would give him an increase in his ad revenue expectations that were substantial. So when he said, I'll give you 20% of the business if you'll do this, he knew exactly, what the benefit was to the success of the business that he was putting in. It's revenue synergies, right? It gets more esoteric when you get into, power over distribution. If Coca-Cola goes out and buys another soft drink supplier, how much muscle do they have in the supermarket to increase shelf space to get better distribution? Or, how much muscle do they have to put a water vending machine next to the Coke machine? Or are they better off putting the water into the Coke machine? That kind of stuff is calculable, and they predict all of that when they do the merger case study. Obviously the corporate stuff, maybe you only need one corporate lawyer, at the top. Maybe you get rid of some overhead. Usually that's not a major piece of the economics. Usually it has to do with the true operations of the business and the costs of operating.
Yeah, you've covered a lot of it in your most recent answer. Could you describe a little bit better for our education how basically you personally or your team goes through the whole due diligence process? Because you've identified how critical it is, that's where the risk is. Your question of how you spending time looking at why will it work or why won't it work. How do you deal with stuff like Rumsfeld's where it says, look, the knowns are, you can get your arms around. How do you get your arms around even thinking about the unknowns?
Well, I mean, let's take an investment that's very topical, right? Our company right now owns a preferred stock in a company called SiriusXM, the satellite radio company. Some of you, may have it. Hopefully, you all will when you put it in your cars. You get addicted. It's very addictive, by the way, as a service. But the question is, we sit there and look at it and say, we've been lucky so far, right? We made an investment in a company when they were in serious financial distress. They had to take money from us or go bankrupt, pretty much. That was their choice. So they took money from us. We made them a loan, and we got, in exchange, a preferred stock that converts into 40% of the company. Okay? It turned out we guessed right. The company, the synergies were there. Once we put the money in, they were able to rapidly improve their company. They paid us back basically all the loan, and we end up owning 40% of the company. This has now been a couple years, and the 40% preferred stock we have in the company is worth about $6 billion today. So basically we made about $6 billion, got all our money back in 2 years. Pretty good deal. Now we're sitting here with 40%. The question is, do we want to, let's say, buy the rest of the company? Okay? Which is not so cheap anymore. Right? To buy the rest of the company, would cost us about $9 billion, assuming they would sell it to us at market. Or maybe we don't want to own the rest of the company, maybe we just want to own another 10% of the company and own 50% of the company. So we got to make a decision, an analysis of this company about what do we think, right? We see the trends look great, they're selling a lot more cars, the more of the cars have the radios in them than used to, the churn, the turnover is down, the prices are up. I mean, everything looks great, right? So you go through all of that, you build models, you have your team building independent models. You look at the model from the company, you look at your own model, you try and see, what's rational. And then you say to yourself, okay, but technologies are changing, right? Most of you guys have smartphones. If you got your smartphone and you want to listen to music, you can probably do it that way, right? There was the iPod, which allowed you could plug that in, or you could get a little FM tuner and it would work on your radio. And how's that going to? So you go through all of these, threats. If this happens, how much is that going to hurt the business? If Howard Stern wins his lawsuit, how much is that going to hurt the business, right? All that kind of stuff. So you do all these projections and you come down and you try and make a decision, what do I do? Do I go spend the money to increase the holding of the company? Is that the right thing to do? Do I say to myself, gee, wouldn't it be nice if I could give my shareholders this $6 billion worth of stock and figure out how to do that tax efficiently? So, my shareholders can make up their own decision about whether they want to put more money into the company or not, and so that the management of that company can go off on their own and run the company. I mean, those are the analyses, and there's no right answer. You do the best analysis you can. You do the best diligence you can. I think in about less than a month now, I'm going to be a witness in a trial in New York where we ended up, this is swift justice. This is almost like the 9/11 guys. 11 years ago, we did a transaction with a French company called Vivendi. Okay? We took a bunch of stock as partial payment for some assets we had in a company called Interactive Corporation. It used to be called USA Networks. Turns out that we found out right after we did the deal that some of their disclosures were lacking in terms of veracity. Okay? They got sued in a big class action suit and they lost. Okay? We sued them based upon our contract with them, absence of disclosure. The thing has been through, the class action's gone through trial. They were adjudged as having committed fraud on the public. Their public disclosures were misleading or absolutely wrong. They were actually in the midst of a liquidity crisis that they didn't disclose to anybody, not even their own board at the time. And so now here's the interesting question on diligence. Their defense, by the way, against our claims is that we were too stupid to do an adequate job of diligence and therefore we deserve to get defrauded. Now this is an interesting defense, but who knows? I mean, it might work. Now their CEO and CFO were both convicted of criminal fraud in France, right? So it's going to be interesting. Our claim is 800 million euros plus interest for the last 11 years. So it's a fairly sizable number. I don't know whether we're going to prevail or not, but it's better to be suing than to be sued, right? You're more relaxed when you testify. So, no, diligence, there's, look, there is no easy answer on diligence. You got to learn the other guy's business as best you possibly can. You've got to use the best professionals that you can find in areas where your own company's expertise is lacking. And, you've got to avoid getting emotional about, I want it, so I'm going to buy it, I mean, that's something that even my wife doesn't do anymore in the car showroom, So, you just really try and it's common sense. I mean, it's just, the big mistakes that people make is they're just not using common sense. And these are complicated transactions, and it's almost like you can't do too much diligence in trying to understand what it is you're proposing to buy, and then also how it would really fit with you. The big mistake I see most companies make is they keep that effort to just a few people in the company. All the people that it's going to affect, if you do the merger, usually aren't involved, right? And it's kind of sprung on them. In fact, that used to be called the mushroom theory of management, which I'm sure have you taught that, Ron? Right? I mean, you know what that is, right? The mushroom theory of acquisition. Keep them in the dark, and when they stick their heads up, can them. Is the theory. So, diligence, obviously, there is no excuse for a bad job of diligence, and yet that's what frequently kills these deals, makes them not what they were intended to be, what they were intended to live up to.
I have a question. So we've talked about a lot in this class and some other classes about human integration, and when you do a merger, you keep the key people. And so I was surprised when you said earlier that you usually get rid of the senior guys. How do you decide?
No, I said in a horizontal.
Okay.
That's in a horizontal. Now, if you're in recent years, we've behaved. Once we were no longer in the cable business per se, so we weren't in a position to do horizontals. We started actually out buying companies. Okay, when you go out and buy a company, the most important thing is the retention of the people who have created the value that you're trying to buy and keep. And so we do all kinds of earn-outs, participative deals in the future. You really want the entrepreneur or entrepreneurs that you're buying to have skin in the game and to stay with the business at least long enough that new professional people can be brought in and can learn the business. Otherwise, it can evaporate very fast on you. So yeah, I mean, the human issues when you're getting into a new business are critical. It's a whole different thing if you're just consolidating existing businesses where there's redundancy everywhere. I mean, pretty typically, like we're in the process of, we own one big chunk of the German cable business. We're just buying, have just been allowed to buy an adjoining large cable operation. I mean, you put a team together of the two companies and they sit down and figure out what the redundancies are. And then you try and find homes for the people that don't fit. But you've got to get rid of redundancy, otherwise you become very inefficient.
Maybe we turn our attention to another favorite topic of yours, leverage. How do you go about figuring what the optimal amount of leverage is for any of the companies that you own, manage?
Well, a lot of it has to do with the predictability of the cash flow stream from the business. The more predictable, let's call it monotonically increasing the cash flow stream, the more comfortable you are taking the leverage ratios up. Cable is a business that has historically been able to support up to 5 times. Obviously, it depends on the interest rate environment. I mean, if you're borrowing money at 10%, leverage, you can't support as much leverage as if money's at 6%. So that's a trade-off. Manufacturing businesses that have cycles, you're never comfortable taking the leverage up nearly as high. It also has to do with the tax posture of the business. If a business is highly taxable, then the interest expense is deductible and you're inclined to take the leverage up somewhat higher. So, it's always a good discipline to say, what is the theory, the leverage theory? How much capital does the company really need? How much should be debt? How much should be equity? Our European cable, our LGI company, we've had the philosophy of 4 times EBITDA in leverage would be the floor and 5 times would be the ceiling. And we go between the two as we do acquisitions. So you acquire something, you take your average leverage up, you grow the business, the synergies kick in, the leverage comes back down, you take the leverage back up for another one, and so on. If you're not finding acquisitions and you're growing your cash flow, you just take your leverage up and shrink your equity. You buy shares back. And you kind of balance between those in that kind of a philosophy. And various companies that I've been involved in adopt different. A good example would be that's Liberty Global 4 to 5, okay, and keeping and that's gross debt, keeping say a half a multiple in cash or liquidity, so that you're never kind of running the risk of a liquidity problem. DirecTV, that I was chairman of up until fairly recently, we adopted a 2.5 times debt ratio, which in their case, their cash flow was growing nicely, so they were just going to continue to take their debt up and use the cash to shrink their equity. There were no real acquisition opportunities that they could discern. Discovery Communications is a company. Right now, their gross leverage is about 1.4 times. Their net leverage is about 0.9. I think they're deciding to take their leverage up over time to 2.5 times and use the cash to shrink their equity. So, it really varies on the nature of the business. But a business that generates a lot of taxable income and has a flywheel, is stable, utility-like in nature, typically will carry more leverage. Public utilities generally are leveraged 50-50 debt equity is the tradition. In fact, when I was a young man, I made a presentation to the AT&T board of directors. This would have been like in 1966. And I suggested to them if they took their debt equity ratio up 1 notch, how that would be much better for the shareholders and very affordable. But they were creatures of tradition. And they were at 2 to 1 equity to debt, and that's where they stayed until they buried the company in debt many years later. So that's the question of leverage. It's very much a function of what you can borrow the money for. Right now, if you have money, you can borrow money real cheap. And if you can borrow money real cheap, then you can make money, right? Just as an investor, forget about companies. Borrow money at 1% and buy AT&T stock that pays a 6% dividend. You make 5% a year, the interest is tax deductible and the dividend is taxed at 15%. So, what could be easier, right? Stable stock, not a lot of volatility, and your return on equity can be very high. Right now, if that's all you're doing, there's a Reg U allows you to borrow 50%, right? So you can probably get an 11% yield return on equity, just like that. So it's a function of cost of money, term, duration, investment opportunities, liquidity of the investment opportunity. If you have a highly liquid portfolio, you can take the leverage pretty high without a lot of risk because you have a lot of liquidity and diversity. So, you know, that's what the long-term capital guys thought, right? It's not unusual for hedge funds to lever, you know. Well, look at Lehman Brothers, great example of over-leverage. They borrowed 40 to 1, right? They were levered 40 times in duration and cost and risk and, you know, liquidity, all of those kind of issues, Ron. So, you know, I like leverage. I think leverage is your friend if you're prudent about it. And particularly if the government makes it tax deductible. Yeah.
I had a question for you. So we've talked a lot about sometimes the bad merger decisions are meant by, you know, CEOs just trying to do something for the company, trying to make a move. But with supposedly they're saying now that the balance sheets of all the corporate America is as good as they have been. They have more cash than ever. Do you think that's going to be a lot of pressure to, you know, I don't know if they want to give money back to shareholders through dividends or if there's going to be a lot of bad merger decisions?
Well,
they're forced into making this.
Well, that's kind of a temporal issue that we all face. I mean, all my companies right now, despite our loving leverage, right at the moment, all my companies are just loaded with cash and don't know what to do with it. They can't find decent acquisitions that they're comfortable with. They're really afraid of the future. I mean, there's a lot of fear of the future right now in terms of both regulation and macro environment. And so companies, treasurers are feeling like they should keep a lot of liquidity. Number three is a lot of that liquidity is overseas. To bring it home, you would have a lot of tax leakage. I mean, companies like Apple, when you see whether they have 100 billion or something of cash, almost all of that is overseas. They haven't paid U.S. taxes on it, and if they don't bring it back to the U.S., they won't pay U.S. taxes on it, okay? So there's a lot of constraints on this cash on U.S. balance sheets. One of my sore points is when you see the talking heads talking about all this cash and all these earnings, keep in mind that for the Fortune 500, half of their earnings are offshore, okay? Which means probably the majority of their cash is offshore, which means that if they're going to spend it, they're going to hire people and expand offshore, okay? I mean, if you really want the answer to the jobs problem in America, look no further than the tax code. Why would Caterpillar bring money back to the U.S. from Brazil instead of expanding in Brazil? Tax rate in Brazil is 18%. Bring it back here, they're going to pay 35% federal and probably on top of that 8% Illinois if they want to put it in Peoria. So, you know, right there is this huge incentive for multinational American companies to continue to grow internationally, invest internationally, grow employees internationally. You know, I mean, GE has been flat in employment in the last 5 years, but they've added 100,000 international employees and eliminated 100,000 U.S. employees. I mean, that's what's happening. So, on the answer of your cash, what do you do with your cash? If you're Apple's CFO, okay, or even Tim Cook, what do? Do you say, let's bring the money home so we can dividend it out, and let's give the government 35, 40% of it? I mean, they're in California, for God's sakes. The corporate rate in California is probably 12% state, and then on top of that, you got local. So, no, they're going to keep the money overseas. In our case, you know, every one of my companies has fairly aggressive stock buyback programs. We are very careful about our tax posture, so we try very hard not to have a lot of tax leakage. And within limits, you can do that. But you know, corporate America has gone through a pretty consistent period now of stock buybacks. It's kind of slowing down right now. The number of new announced programs is down quite a bit this year versus last year. What has become popular this year is increasing your dividend periodically. because that's supposed to be, according to the Wall Street geniuses, that's the bright spot, which is companies that increase their dividends systematically. So even if it's only 0.8%, if it goes to 0.9%, that's supposed to be really good. Okay? I mean, I don't know. But keep in mind, when you look at corporate balance sheets, when you're looking at big corporations, the money's offshore, the bulk of it. And the bulk of the future earnings is offshore. And that will probably persist unless there's a change in the tax code. So,
Do you think a short term, like, you know, I know they did, how many years ago they had tax-free where you could repatriate the money?
yeah.
Do you think a lot of it would? Or do you think it's long-term tax policy?
Well, if there was a tax holiday and you could bring money back, well, you'd bring a lot of money back. If they said you can bring it back, but you only got to spend it on X, Y, and Z, then it would depend on what X, Y, and Z are, right? I mean, the rub, the last time the politicians say, yeah, we let them bring money back, but then they dividend it out to their shareholders, so what good was it? Well, you know, presumably the shareholders then spend it on something useful. But so it would be stimulative. But I'm afraid that the revisions in the tax code are going to be very complicated, because if you listen to the political talk, just lowering the corporate rate is a windfall to some people, and it won't change the behavior of some other people. So, you know, I'm not sure that it's a simple solution as just lowering the marginal rate. I mean, it would be stimulative and it would bring money back. And presumptively, you would want your country to bring all the money back from overseas and reinvest it domestically. So you should have a zero marginal rate on repatriation of foreign earnings. I mean, if you're logical about it and you want the economy to grow domestically, that's what you would do. They're very unpopular with certain segments of the population. So, and I think it's a standoff. I think the companies that have all this cash offshore, they're either going to invest it offshore if the growth continues, right? Or they're just going to wait out some kind of change in the tax law, but they're not going to take a huge hit. Meanwhile, they can invest it offshore. And there's all kinds of rules, by the way, in terms of things called PFICs and so on that are, I don't want to clutter you up with, but make it very difficult for individuals to behave like Apple. Otherwise, people would be doing it. But, you know, your big technology companies, Apple, Google, Microsoft, Intel, years ago, they moved their intellectual property to tax havens. And so they have transfer prices so that even when you buy an iPad in the U.S., it probably is not very profitable for Apple on their books in the U.S. The money's all being made in Ireland or Singapore. That's where they're recording the gain, the profit. And therefore they don't pay any taxes or very de minimis taxes. I think Apple's average tax rate was like 8% globally. So, you know, and they got big staffs of guys who have figured out how to do this, and they're pretty efficient at it. So that's my answer for the corporate cash question. Now, little guys don't have cash and they can't borrow it, which is another reason why the economy is stalled. If you're creditworthy and you're big, you can borrow money, lots of it, and cheap. If you're small and more regional, you know, the banking system has largely got you shut out right now.
Again, the topic that we had talked about as the class reviewed are the history of tracking stocks with your company. Maybe provide, I think you are probably the most experienced of anyone in corporate America with tracking stocks. Maybe give a little of your philosophy and why you do tracking stocks.
Well, first of all, does everybody know what a tracking stock sort of is?
Provide a little background according to.
Okay, it's like one company that has various assets, and its shareholders, it would like shareholders to be able to focus their interest on some of those assets and other shareholders on others, so that you don't want to have separate companies for various reasons. Now, what are those reasons? The number one reason is because they're all part of one balance sheet. In other words, they're owned collectively. I always take this into taxes, and I'll take it into taxes again. As long as you get these businesses together, there's no cost, no tax cost in separation. They can be run by one set of employees, and they consolidate with each other for federal tax purposes. So if under one company you have two businesses, and one business is profitable and the other is unprofitable because let's say it's growing fast, the two are together, shelter each other's taxes, provide each other with financial strength. So the idea is one balance sheet, in other words, one set of assets, the ability to borrow money collectively, but then two equities. And that way, those shareholders that want to participate in this kind of a business can. And a good example in our history was we had TCI, the cable company, we had Liberty, the programming company. Both were together, but we had a stock that was Liberty and we had a stock that was TCI. Shareholders that liked the cable business, they could own TCI stock. Shareholders that liked Liberty, they could own the Liberty stock. One board of directors, and complete immunity from the antitrust laws, everything you did inside that company, because you can't conspire against yourself. So all the transactions between Liberty as a programmer and TCI as a distributor were immune from federal antitrust laws. So you had legal immunity from antitrust laws, you had tax consolidation, okay? And you had scale because you were borrowing together. So kind of like a marriage in which, you have one bank account and two checkbooks, right? Think of it that way. And we've created these over the years because they've had special purposes. I regard them as largely transitory. In other words, if you're incubating a business within a company, but it's not ready for prime time, it's not ready to stand on its own, tracking stock is a great way to identify it, focus a light on it, raise capital for it even, but not separate it and make it out on its own yet. And so we've been in and out of tracking stocks for a number of years, and they're almost always for some special structural purpose. And they live for a while, and then they usually no longer are needed or no longer fulfill the need. Now, we're in the process right now. About 6 months ago, we wiped out our last tracking stock. We actually merged two tracking stocks together, and so there was no more tracking stock. And I think that was the last tracking stock in the U.S., as far as we know. And we're about now to create a new tracking stock because we have a company that is made up of some operating businesses, the home shopping business, QVC, a whole bunch of internet retail businesses and stuff like that we own 100% of, that are solid, growing, healthy companies. And then we have a whole bunch of crazy investments, not crazy, but investments. And then we have a whole bunch of complex derivatives. We have investments in solar and clean coal and all kinds of tax-driven investments that we would not have made but for the tax attributes that go with them. And it's kind of confusing And so what we decided to do was separate these two with a tracking stock. And so what we're saying is we're going to have a company called Ventures. It's going to have all of this noisy stuff in it, all of these complex derivatives. You know, these are things that essentially have 20 years to live, and during those 20 years they have very favorable tax attributes, and you know, et cetera. And on the other hand, these kind of plain vanilla operating businesses that are successful, that are generating cash, that are hiring lots of people, and so on. So we're going to separate, but we don't want to spin them off for a lot of reasons. Number one of which is the Delaware court said we can't. And so we got these two that will have one equity, but they'll be two well-identified separate businesses. And what that does for us allows our shareholders to focus on what they're interested in. But more than that, it allows us to have management that focuses on the issues of the two separate companies. So it's very much a management focus issue, as well as a shareholder issue. And so you have over here a risky, complicated, smaller but potentially valuable business. And then over here you have a big, straightforward, predictable, grind it out, just manage it, operate it, grow it kind of a business. And that allows us to have these two existing in parallel. There may be a point when the two businesses could potentially be separated. But in the short run, the way to think about it is this one is effectively a public hedge fund with very complex derivatives, the kind of stuff normally you wouldn't take public because it's too complicated and analysts don't want to mess with it. And over here, you got plain vanilla. And so you got the two of them cohabiting in the shell, okay, and with different equities, but sharing the same general balance sheet. And one board of directors deciding on, you know, how they live together, you know, solving any disputes.
I'm just curious if tracking stocks are really a sustainable long-term approach in dealing with this, because I see that there might be some issues with culture, because you have all these companies, which I view almost like subsidiaries, which are very diverse, and you're still being governed or managed by a daddy company.
Right.
And then you have these orphans who eventually will become part of the big family or will remain orphaned upon selling. So I just wonder if you could speak to that and maybe talk about any occasions where it was sustainable, maybe more than 10 years.
Yeah, no, for us, they always seem to have served their purpose, and then we can live without them at a point in time. So the nice thing about it is you have one board of directors deciding those issues. So you don't get into valuation problems or lawsuits from this group of shareholders doesn't like this, or, you know, two boards combating. In that sense, it's turned out to work pretty well. I think it only really works, in all honesty, when you have strong control. Like, you know, I can tell them what to do. If you didn't have somebody who could tell them what to do, it probably wouldn't work. I mean, at the end of the day. I mean, that's really the issue. So there's nothing like a benevolent dictator, you know, in certain structures where you know, because you do have to be Solomon frequently in that structure. You really do have to say, no, I'm sorry, but you get to do this deal and you get to do that deal, right? Somebody has to decide that. Otherwise you have, you know, it's like two siblings competing over what's in the fridge, right? If there's only one banana split in there, right? And you got two kids, how do you decide who gets the banana split? Well, you got to have a strong parent. Otherwise, they just fight. So yeah, I mean, the problem could be in a structure like that without strong control that they would just compete for the available resources. And they're two separate equities, and so theoretically they're saying, no, you know, I need to use that extra dollar of debt capacity, you can't have it. You know, that could be the argument going back and forth. This has been endlessly argued. It has not worked. I have to say, in all honesty, tracking stocks have not worked for most people who have tried them. They have always worked for us. Okay? But I think that's part of the control issue. Keep in mind, I always control my company, so at the end of the day, it's nice to be able to fire the board if they can't agree. It's a luxury, a structural luxury, you could say, right?
Maybe just, question, go ahead. I don't want to dominate, so if, maybe just talk a little bit about this whole notion of tax efficiency. You talked a fair amount about it, and
Yeah, I mean, sure.
And, yeah, I mean, sort of how you do that, why you do that, and maybe what advice you'd give to this group in terms of how to get better at tax efficiency.
Yeah, well, first of all, I always used to say that, you know, the government is your partner for life, okay? They just don't get to come to all the meetings. That's the only edge you got. So, you know, they may get it in the end, but can you invest it better than they can during the interim, I guess is the question. Let me use as an example of this. I had a meeting with an MIT professor 2 days ago who's launched a new company, and he's got Bill Gates, and he's got Total. He's got some pretty good investors. And it's venture capital right now, and he was out visiting, and I was saying, you know, how come, you know, you finally brought in a venture capital firm to fill out your next round, right? And he said, well, everybody thought it would be a good idea to have an experienced venture capital firm because I'm not a business guy and, you know, yada, yada, yada. And I said, well, you know, how did they structure the deal? Because startups, venture capital, you know, startups have losses. What happens to the losses? You ever think about that in a startup deal? Well, they accumulate, right? You get a net operating loss carry forward. I said, well, you know, if that net operating loss carry forward was monetized currently, instead of just accruing, you'd need a lot less venture capital, right? That's tax efficiency, right? So if a deal is generating losses and the tax savings on using those losses is 40%, right? So the government is effectively kicking in 40% of every dollar of loss if you can figure out how to structure it appropriately. It just dramatically reduces the upfront capital requirements. Another way to look at it is when you, for years, I couldn't understand, people were making acquisitions with their stock, right? And when you do it with your stock, you don't get a step up in the basis of what you acquire. The tax laws change over time, but that was basically the rule. Whereas if you bought the asset with cash or debt, right, you got to step up the asset. What that meant was you get to write off what you bought against your operations, which means you got a 40% partner in sharing the downside risk, i.e. the government, if you're taxable, okay? And so I always tend to look at these things and say, how do I structure the deal such that I have a partner if it doesn't work, okay? If I'm taxable, how can I make the government my partner in, now this can have thousands of different ways. A tracking stock is one way. When Sprint, the big telecom company, right, which used to be a big terrestrial telecom company, when they wanted to go into the wireless business, they didn't have the capital to do it on their own. And they thought maybe the cable companies should participate and help them market the wireless service that would result. So they created a thing called Sprint PCS. Okay? This was an entity set up to go to the government, bid on the licenses, on the frequencies that were required to underwrite the business. So we set up a deal that was 50% owned by Sprint, 50% owned by the cable companies. Okay? It was set up as a tracking stock subsidiary of Sprint. Okay? We knew it was going to have massive startup losses, right? Sprint was a taxable company. By being a tracking stock, the losses that starting up in the wireless business represented would offset the taxable income that Sprint was generating. That 40% of those losses would flow right back into the business that was being started up, quarterly. The cable guys, put in their equity. The Sprint guys put in their equity. The government puts in its equity, right? And we ran it that way until the tax basis in the entity was burned through. We went, to zero, at which point it was merged into Sprint. We all got Sprint stock. So it was a very efficient capital structure in which we reduced the amount of equity. Think about it. Normally, if you think about it, a 2-to-1 debt equity ratio is not unusual in a business, right? Well, if the equity is put up by the government, that's the 40%, right? You can have a very efficient capital structure, and therefore the return on your equity can be very high. That's tax efficiency. There's structurally all kinds of technology, okay, in order to monetize tax losses. But this is a very important part if you're going to be in and around investing. How do you use the tax structure as your friend in order to help finance things? Tax benefits, in some countries, tax benefits can be bought and sold. In Canada, you can buy and sell losses amongst companies. There's a market. In the U.S., you can do that with tax credits. You can't very easily do it with losses. The complexity of using somebody else's losses, if they're not part of you, you can even use, if you have a kid that wants to start up a business and he has a trust, the trust can be an LLC member in the startup business. You can take the losses into the trust. You can shelter the gains in the trust, right? And then once the business is successful, you just transfer the LLC interest, the membership interest to the kid, and you're done, right? And maybe your kid can go take care of himself then. Get off the dole, get out of the house, get off the couch. But no, keep in mind that is in fact life. That the government, in its desire to raise money for its purposes, makes itself your partner in your business in every country, to a lesser or greater degree, and you've got to follow the rules, but they are your partner, and you just don't want them taking their share out early. I think it's the way I look at it. But it does. In our company, the largest in corporate headquarters, the largest group we have is our tax group. It's a lot of capital that they have to worry about, and so that's tax efficiency. Now, leverage, tax efficiency go hand in hand, because at least in most tax codes, interest expense is deductible as a business expense. So the more the leverage, the less the equity, the higher the tax deduction, the further out the government's claim on cash flow. So it's all of a piece. I think that's, and you know, you create all kinds of financial instruments are created to reflect those facts. You know, preferred stock, which is between corporations, is taxed at a much lower tax rate. You know, when I was in the banking business, we had a thing called tax-deductible preferreds, trust preferreds, which were perfected to be deductible to the bank, but taxed as preferred dividends to the individual holding the instrument. This is very clever. The government shut that down. But it worked for a while. So, yeah, I mean, it's not unpatriotic. In fact, Abraham Lincoln said only a fool fails to avoid taxes. Evade is a different matter. That's illegal. But avoid, if you can organize your business to avoid taxes, it's perfectly legitimate. It also keeps a lot of tax lawyers employed.
We have time for 2 short questions or 1 longer question. So do we have any takers, or you leave it to me?
You could ask what Dan Sierra's doing for me.
Yes.
Some of you folks might know him.
Yeah. Let's introduce Dan Sierra. Dan is a DU alum. He took strategic finance in the fall, and so now he works for Dr. Malone, or
He's a consultant.
consultant. Okay.
A paid consultant.
Paid consultant, and maybe give the group a flavor of what Dan is doing and the things you wished he would have learned while he was here.
No, what Dan is doing is he's addressing the very simple question. So if you got a pile of cash, how do you invest? If you want to be diversified, you want reasonable liquidity, reasonable safety, reasonable returns, right? And keeping in mind the tax leakage, all of those elements. So we're coming up the learning curve. So at the moment, he's got us invested in, 42 equities?
Yeah, some of them are straight equity, some of them are derivatives.
But mostly playing the option, the short-term option game at the moment. Evaluating some other strategies. So that, you know, that's the most fundamental of challenges right there. And we're learning. You wouldn't think you could learn in, you know, something as simple as that. You know, there is actually quite a steep learning curve.
Well, I think you joked as I was walking out one day that the real grad school was just not starting.
Well, yeah. But it's challenging. And, you know, ask anybody that, you know, wants to go out and invest. I mean, most money managers have had a terrible time the last 10 years in terms of any kind of consistent track record. And so that's that one. And
Jen has a question.
I do. Dr. Malone, we've taken cable executives to universities all around the country. And one of the things we're hearing from students is that they don't think that the cable industry is high tech. And it's horrifying to us at the Cable Center. And I wondered if you could talk a little bit about how high tech the industry is.
well, I mean, there are elements of it that are, of course, very high tech, cutting edge. I know in LGI's case, they have a new set-top box, if you want to call it that is effectively a computer system. It's a brand new Intel chip, you know, very high speed. It's got to relate to the internet. It's, you know, it's got, you know, essentially two Wi-Fi modems in it. It's got enormous memory. You know, it's a pretty sophisticated device, which they develop. They do the systems engineering and systems integration. You know, the vendors, you know, the cable companies doesn't go out and reinvent the chip industry. They don't go out and reinvent the software industry. So you've got Samsung, you've got an Israeli company doing the software integration. You've got Intel building a new chip. There's probably 2 other vendors that are in the process. So that's pretty high-tech stuff. You know, the box is every bit as complicated as an iPad or devices of that kind. You know, I'd say the engineering in the cable industry tends to be more systems engineering, more integration of technologies. You know, the cable industry is fundamentally optical fiber now. Trying to migrate to cloud-based software solutions. High tech, I wouldn't call it high tech. I'd call it middle tech, or, you know, systems. It's more integration of technology into. But you know, if you look at the headquarters of most large cable companies today, probably 60% of the employees are engineering. The kind of engineering they do is systems integration. So, you know, I don't know. I mean, technology is a hard thing to say what's high tech. I mean, high tech is usually materials science. I mean, this MIT professor I was with 2 days ago, that's high tech, right? Liquid metal batteries, you know, dealing with molten magnesium for energy storage. You know, it's pretty high-tech stuff. Magnetic valves in liquid metals. Yeah, kind of cutting-edge stuff. Or, you know, if you're dealing with stem cell research and understanding the human genome, that's pretty high-tech stuff. The cable guys are more engineers than scientists, I would say. And their technology is more into applications than... But these are large-scale systems, and so, you know, I never wanted to be high-tech. I always figured, you know, medium tech. You know, and I grew up with technical degrees all the way through, so, you know, I've had some exposure to technologies. No, cable's a business. And it uses a technology in the business that's a rapidly evolving technology. And the systems are large and complex. But it's systems engineering as opposed to, you know, anything getting down to fundamental materials or basic physics, you know, stuff of that nature. I would think. I mean, from my point of view, after getting you know, degrees in math and engineering, electrical engineering, and computer science, it's been the engineering of financial systems, right? Large economic models, operations research, basically, which is, you know, the modeling of large, complex systems. I hope that answers. That's my perspective.
Well, we're at the hour where the next class is going to come breaking in.
So we're going to get our butts out of it.
But we want to be respectful of our colleagues here we have arranged for the Dean's Dining Room to continue the discussion. And if you have questions, we encourage you to come to the Dean's Dining Room and ask those questions directly of Dr. Malone. We'll spend a few minutes there. This way we can vacate this room and the next class come in. So we hope you do that, but please join me in thanking Dr. Malone